The gun was in Marshal Covington's hand before the screen door had finished slamming behind him. "You have exactly 10 seconds to explain what you are doing on my land," he said, his voice low and absolute, the kind of quiet that preceded storms. The afternoon sun carved harsh shadows across his jaw, and his dark eyes were fixed on the woman standing in the middle of his north pasture, with her boots sunk 2 inches deep in his creek mud, and a rusted surveying stake clutched in both hands like a weapon she did not yet know how to use. Beatrice Beckett did not run. That was the first thing that surprised him. Every man who had ever stood in that pasture with a gun pointed in his general direction had run, eventually. Most of them ran immediately. But this woman, this slight, dark-haired woman in a gray widow's dress that was already ruined at the hem with creek mud, simply raised her chin and looked at him with eyes so steady and so achingly composed that Marshal Covington felt something shift behind his ribs that he could not immediately name. "Your surveying stake is wrong," she said, "and I can prove it." He had not been expecting that. In 38 years of living hard on the Texas frontier, in all his years of boundary disputes and cattle wars and neighbors who had come and gone and sometimes simply disappeared, not one of them had ever greeted his drawn pistol with a land survey argument. "You are trespassing," he said. "Your eastern fence line is 17 feet into the property I purchased from the Harlow estate 2 weeks ago," she replied. "I am not trespassing. You are encroaching." He stared at her for a long moment. Then he lowered the gun. Not because he believed her, not yet, but because something in the absolute stillness of her expression told him that whatever was happening here, it was going to require more than a firearm to resolve. He would later think about that moment often, in the months that followed. He would think about how he had stood there in the afternoon heat with his gun at his side and looked at Beatrice Beckett for the first time, and how the world had been, in some fundamental and irreversible way, different afterward. But that was later. And the story of how they arrived at that particular afternoon in the North Pasture was one that neither of them could have predicted 3 months earlier, when life had been altogether quieter and lonelier, and in its own way, much more dangerous. The summer of 1878 had come to Haskell County, Texas, with a ferocity that left the grass burnt and gold before June was finished. The heat was merciless. It pressed down on the scattered homesteads and cattle operations like a physical weight, and the men and women who endured it did so with the particular grim determination of people who had chosen this land freely and refused to be beaten by it. Marshal Covington had lived on the Covington Ranch for 11 years. He had built the main house himself, log by log, in the summer of 1867 when he was 27 years old, and the war was 2 years finished, and he needed something to do with his hands and his grief and his enormous, unmanageable energy. The ranch was 1,200 acres of rolling Texas grassland, with a creek that ran clear 9 months out of 12, and a natural spring that had never once gone dry. He ran 800 head of cattle, employed 6 full-time ranch hands, and had built by sheer force of will and relentless work one of the most productive operations in the county. He was also, by universal agreement among the residents of Haskell County, the most difficult man to know in the territory. This was not entirely unfair. Marshall was not cruel, but he was demanding in a way that most people found exhausting. He was exacting about his land, his cattle, and the precise terms of every agreement he ever made. He had been in 3 separate legal disputes over property boundaries, all of which he had won. He had fired 2 ranch foremen, not for dishonesty but for sloppiness. He had been engaged once, briefly, to a woman named Clara Whitmore, who had arrived from Austin with every intention of marrying him, and had departed 6 months later, citing irreconcilable differences in temperament, which in Haskell County was understood to mean that she had finally taken a clear look at Marshal Covington's actual personality and made a rational decision. He was, in short, a man who had organized his life very carefully around the absence of chaos, the absence of surprise, and the absence of anything he could not control. He was 38 years old and alone, and though he would have vigorously denied it to anyone who asked, deeply, quietly, thoroughly lonely in the particular way of people who are too proud to admit it and too stubborn to do anything about it. The Harlow property sat directly to the east of the Covington ranch, separated by that contested creek and a fence line that had been a source of low-grade irritation for Marshall for 4 years. Old Elias Harlow had died the previous winter, leaving behind a modest homestead of 340 acres, a dilapidated farmhouse in genuine need of repair, and no heirs close enough or interested enough to take the land on. The property had sat empty through the spring, and Marshall had privately assumed it would continue to sit empty until someone made him a reasonable offer for it, which he fully intended to accept. He had not been consulted when the Harlow estate sold the land in early June to a buyer from San Antonio. He had not been informed that the buyer was a widow. He had certainly not been prepared for Beatrice Beckett. She arrived on a Tuesday morning in the second week of June, in a wagon driven by a hired man from town, who unloaded her belongings with professional efficiency and departed before noon, leaving her standing in the yard of the Harlow place with 2 trunks, a wooden crate of books, and the expression of a woman who had made a decision and was committed to seeing it through regardless of cost. Marshall saw the wagon from his upper pasture, where he was checking fence lines with his foreman, a solid, taciturn man named Deke Harmon who had worked the Covington ranch for 6 years and understood that his employer did not enjoy speculation. "Somebody bought the Harlow place," Deke observed. "I see that," Marshall said. "Wonder who," Deke said. "We'll know soon enough," Marshall said, and turned his horse back toward the main pasture because there were always more important things to attend to than wondering about neighbors. He was right that they would know soon enough. He was not right about most of what happened afterward. Her name, he learned from the postmaster in town when he went in on Thursday for supplies, was Beckett, a widow out of San Antonio. Young, apparently, for a widow, somewhere in her early 30s. Her husband had been a physician named Thomas Beckett who had died of cholera 18 months earlier while working in one of the city's poorer districts. She had no children. She had sold the San Antonio house, settled her husband's debts, and purchased the Harlow property outright with the remaining capital because she had wanted, the postmaster relayed with evident interest, to start something new. Marshall had nodded, filed this information away in the part of his mind reserved for practical matters, and gone home. He told himself he was not thinking about her. He was, of course, thinking about her. He was thinking about the specific arithmetic of her situation, which seemed to him reckless. A woman alone, with limited capital, purchasing a property that had been neglected for a full year, attempting to establish some kind of viable operation on the Texas frontier in the middle of a drought. The numbers did not add up. Whatever she intended to do out there, she was going to need help she probably had not accounted for, and help in Haskell County came at a price that inexperienced newcomers routinely failed to anticipate. He was not concerned about her. He was concerned about the practical implications for the region, which was an entirely different and much more rational thing. This was what he told himself on Thursday evening and on Friday and on the first 3 days of the following week. On Wednesday of that second week, she appeared at his gate. She had walked. That was the first thing he noticed. The walk from the Harlow farmhouse to the Covington ranch gate was 3/4 of a mile in the sun, and she had done it in the middle of the afternoon wearing a sensible dark dress and carrying a small lidded basket, and she looked, when she reached his gate, exactly as composed as if she had simply stepped across a parlor. Marshall was working in the near yard when she arrived, mending a section of harness leather with the focused attention he brought to all physical work. He looked up and saw her standing at the gate and did not immediately move, because he was not accustomed to being surprised on his own property. She waited. She did not call out or wave. She simply stood at the gate with her basket and watched him with those steady, dark gray eyes, and something about the completeness of her patience made him put down the harness and walk over. "Mrs. Beckett," he said, because he had been raised with manners even if they sometimes got buried under everything else. "Mr. Covington," she said. Her voice was measured, a little lower than he had expected, the kind of voice that was accustomed to precision. "I hope I am not interrupting anything important." "You are interrupting something," he said, "but I will hear what you have to say." There was a brief pause in which most people would have been flustered. Beatrice was not. "I wanted to introduce myself properly," she said. "I am aware we are neighbors, and I believe neighbors who do not speak are neighbors who eventually have disputes. I would prefer to avoid that if at all possible." He looked at her for a moment. "That is a practical view." "I am generally a practical woman," she said. She held up the basket slightly. "I also brought bread, because I was raised to believe that introductions are better with bread." He found, to his considerable surprise, that he almost smiled. He took the basket. He opened the gate. "You had better come in then," he said. They sat on the front porch of the main house because it was too hot inside, and because sitting on porches was what people in Haskell County did when there was talking to be done. His housekeeper, a capable woman named Rosa Delgado, who had worked for Marshall for 4 years, and was the only person in the county who regularly argued with him and won, brought out cold water, and then disappeared with the particular discretion of someone who sensed that something interesting was happening. Beatrice Beckett ate bread and drank water, and explained her plans with the directness of someone who had thought them through carefully, and was not looking for permission, only for information. She intended to cultivate a kitchen garden and expand it into a modest vegetable operation. She had already made contact with a seed merchant in Abilene. She understood the drought conditions and had specific plans for irrigation using the creek. She intended to keep chickens and possibly a small number of dairy cows, and she was aware that she would need to hire help for the heavier work. Marshall listened to all of this with the analytical attention he gave to anything that involved operational planning, and found, somewhat to his annoyance, that her plans were not nearly as improvised as he had assumed. She had done real research. The irrigation scheme in particular showed a level of practical thought that surprised him. "The creek," he said, when she had finished. "The eastern fork runs through the boundary between our properties." "I know," she said. "I have read the survey documents from the original Harlow purchase." "Those surveys are outdated," he said. "There have been disputes about the precise eastern boundary of my property." "There have been disputes," she agreed. "From what I have been able to determine, the disputes were resolved in your favor by a county judge in 1875. "They were. I have also read the 1875 judgment," she said. "And I believe there may be an error in the resurvey that was conducted afterward." He put down his water glass very carefully. "That resurvey was conducted under my supervision." "I know," she said again. Her eyes did not waver. "I am not suggesting anyone acted in bad faith. I believe it may have been a technical error. I intend to have a qualified surveyor come out from Abilene to take new measurements." He was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to become uncomfortable for anyone else sitting on that porch. Beatrice held his gaze without difficulty. "You have been here 2 weeks," he said finally. 10 days, she corrected. 10 days, he said. "And you have already read the county survey records and the 1875 legal judgment." "I like to understand the ground I am standing on," she said, "literally and otherwise." He looked at her for a long moment with an expression that no one in Haskell County had ever quite been able to read. Then he said, "Let the surveyor come, but I will have my own man present." "That is entirely fair," she said. She left 20 minutes later. She walked back across the pasture toward the Harlow place in the long slant of the late afternoon light, and Marshall stood on his porch and watched her go and tried to identify the feeling in his chest, which was unfamiliar and somewhat inconvenient. It was not attraction, he told himself. It was alertness. She was a potential complication to his eastern boundary situation, and he was simply paying appropriate attention to a practical problem. That was all. Rosa appeared at his shoulder and looked at the retreating figure of Beatrice Beckett, and then looked at Marshall with an expression that contained an entire essay's worth of meaning. "Not a word," Marshall said. Rosa said nothing. Her silence was extremely loud. The surveyor from Abilene arrived on the 14th of July, a thin, meticulous man named Caldwell who charged by the day and took measurements with the focused intensity of a man who understood that his work had legal consequences. Marshall brought Deke Harmon. Beatrice arrived alone, carrying her copy of the original survey documents in a leather satchel, and she walked the boundary line with Caldwell and Marshall and Deke for 4 hours in the July heat, without once complaining about the temperature or her boots or anything else. Marshall watched her from the corner of his eye throughout the process and said very little. Caldwell made his final calculation at 4 in the afternoon, crouching over his transit and his paper, and then straightened and looked at both parties with the expression of a man who delivers news for a living and has learned to do so neutrally. "The 1875 resurvey contained a reference error," he said. "The baseline was measured from the wrong stake. The fence line as currently constructed is approximately 17 feet into the property of record sold to Mrs. Beckett." There was a silence that lasted perhaps 5 seconds. "I see," Marshall said. He did not look at Beatrice. He looked at the fence line. He looked at it for a long time, and she waited because she was good at waiting. "The fence will need to be moved," he said finally. "Yes," she said. "I will have my men do it within 2 weeks." "That is very reasonable of you," she said, and there was no triumph in her voice, no satisfaction at being right, just the quiet certainty of a woman who had expected, all along, that reason would prevail if given the opportunity. He looked at her then directly, and she met his eyes, and something passed between them that neither of them would have been able to articulate precisely, but that both of them felt with the clarity of a bell struck cleanly. "You knew before you came to the ranch that first day," he said. "I suspected," she said. "I wanted to be sure before I said anything. Why come to me first? Why not simply hire Caldwell yourself and present me with the finding?" She considered this for a moment. "Because I am going to be your neighbor for a long time," she said, "and I would rather be your neighbor than your opponent." He held her gaze for another moment. Then he said, "Mrs. Beckett, Mr. Covington, would you like to ride back rather than walk? I can have a horse brought." It was not an apology. Marshall Covington did not, as a general rule, apologize. But it was, in its way, something adjacent to one, and Beatrice understood that and accepted it in the spirit it was offered. "Thank you," she said. "That would be very kind." The fence was moved on the 20th of July. Marshall supervised the work personally, which was unusual enough that Deke raised his eyebrows but did not comment. Beatrice watched from her side of the new line, not interfering, not hovering, simply present in the way she had of being present, which was quiet and complete and somehow more substantial than the loudness of most people. When the work was done, Marshall looked across the fresh line of posts at her. "There is a section of your creek bank that is badly eroded," he said. "If you do not reinforce it before the fall rains, you will lose your irrigation access." She blinked once. "I know," she said. "I have not yet determined the best approach." "Willow stakes and rock fill," he said. "I will send Deke over to show you." "I cannot pay for that kind of labor right now," she said, and the admission cost her something. He could see that in the slight tension of her jaw, but she made it directly, without deflection. "I did not say you would pay for it," he said, and turned and walked back toward his property before she could respond. That evening, Rosa set a plate in front of him and said without preamble, "The widow woman." "Her name is Mrs. Beckett," Marshall said. "Mrs. Beckett, then," Rosa said. "You like her." "I respect her," he said. "She is practical and she does not waste words." "So do you," Rosa said. He picked up his fork. "Rosa, I am just saying. I know what you are saying. She is alone out there, you know. A woman alone in this country in a drought year with a house that needs work and a piece of land that needs more work. That is hard. She is not a helpless woman." "No," Rosa agreed, sitting down across from him with her own plate in the comfortable way of someone who had long since ceased to pretend she was merely an employee. "She is not. That is what makes it interesting. He did not answer that. He ate his dinner and looked out the window at the darkening east where the Harlow place, the Beckett place now, sat in the last of the light, and he was not thinking about Beatrice Beckett's gray eyes or the way she had held his gaze in the pasture without flinching. He was not thinking about those things at all. He sent Deke over the next morning with 2 other hands and the materials for the creek bank repair. He told Deke it was neighborly. Deke told him yes, sir, with the exact same expression Rosa had been wearing the day before. The repair took 2 days. On the second day, Beatrice brought lunch to the work crew, which was not expected, and she worked alongside Deke on the simpler parts of the reinforcement, learning as she went with an attention to detail that Deke reported to Marshall that evening with evident respect. "She asks good questions," Deke said. "Doesn't pretend she knows things she doesn't, but she learns fast. Watch me set the first 3 stakes and then set the next 2 herself. Right technique, first try." Marshall nodded and said nothing and went back to his ledger. He was over at the Beckett property twice more in the following 2 weeks, on practical pretexts that were genuine enough. The first to look at a section of her barn roof that she had asked about, and the second because he was riding the eastern boundary anyway and stopped to check the new fence posts. Both times he ended up staying longer than he had planned. Both times the conversation moved from practical matters to other things, gradually and then suddenly, the way water finds its level. She had been reading, she told him on the second visit, about improved irrigation methods being developed further west. She had ideas about her kitchen garden that were more ambitious than anything he had expected from someone so recently arrived. She had a particular stillness when she listened to him talk about cattle operations that was different from polite attention. It was genuine interest, the kind that asks specific questions and remembers the answers. He found himself telling her things he had not talked about to another person in years. About the ranch, about the problems of the drought cycle, about the particular challenge of maintaining herd quality when water access was uncertain. He found himself listening to her responses with the same quality of attention, because she was worth listening to. She thought before she spoke, and she meant what she said, and she did not say things she did not mean. He told himself this was simply collegial conversation between neighbors with shared practical concerns. In the first week of August, Haskell County experienced an event that cut through whatever polite distance Marshall had been maintaining between himself and the reality of what he felt. There had been a man coming around the Beckett property. His name was Gerald Voss, and he was a land speculator who had been operating in the area for 2 years, picking up distressed properties from widows and homesteaders who had run out of money or will or both, always at prices substantially below market value. He was not technically breaking any laws. He was simply very good at finding people in difficult circumstances and making offers at precisely the right moment of vulnerability. Marshall knew Gerald Voss. He had watched him work on 2 previous properties and had thought it was not his concern because it was not his land. He had been wrong about that, and he had known he was wrong and he had done nothing, and that knowledge sat in his chest like something unresolved. Deke told him on a Monday that Voss had been seen at the Beckett gate twice in the past week. Marshall was in the north pasture when he heard this, checking on a section of fence, and he was very still for a moment in the way he was still when he was deciding something. "She let him in?" he asked. "Second time she did," Deke said. Talked to him on the porch for about 20 minutes. He rode to the Beckett property that afternoon. He did not announce himself. He rode up to the gate and Beatrice was in the yard, carrying feed to the small chicken coop she had built in the east corner, and she looked up when she heard the horse and her expression was unreadable. "Mr. Covington," she said. "Mrs. Beckett." He dismounted and tied the horse to the gate post. "You have been speaking to Gerald Voss." A pause. "That is correct. I want you to understand what Gerald Voss is," he said. "He is a man who makes his living purchasing distressed properties from people who have been led to believe they have no other options. He identifies women alone, people new to the area, people who are facing their first hard season. He offers them what seems like a fair price and is not, and he creates the impression of trouble where none necessarily exists to make them feel that selling is their only choice. She had stopped moving. She was looking at him with an expression he could not quite read. "He told me," she said slowly, "that there is likely to be a water dispute this fall over the creek access, that your operation would draw enough from the northern fork to significantly reduce my irrigation supply." "That is untrue," Marshall said. "I have drawn from the northern fork every year since 1869, and the flow to the southern fork has not been materially affected." "He said you would say that." "I imagine he did." He held her gaze. "I can show you the water level records. I keep them every year. You can see for yourself that the southern flow rate in September and October has been consistent within a narrow range for the past 9 years. She was quiet for a moment. The chickens moved around her feet. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because it is the truth," he said. "That is not the whole reason," she said. He looked at her steadily. She was right, and they both knew it. "No," he said, "it is not." Another silence, longer this time, filled with the sound of the August heat and the distant complaint of the cattle and the light wind moving through the grass. "Come inside," she said. "I have coffee." He went inside. The farmhouse was better than he had expected. She had been at it for 2 months and the visible work was substantial. The floors had been scrubbed, the walls whitewashed, the sagging kitchen shelf reinforced. She had hung plain curtains and arranged the modest furniture with an eye for practical use of space. The books were shelved along the main room wall, organized in a way that suggested they were regularly read rather than displayed. It was a serious room, a working room, and it looked like her. She made coffee on the iron stove and brought 2 cups to the table and sat down across from him, and he spread out the water level records he had brought without consciously deciding to bring them, and they went through the numbers together in the late afternoon light, and at some point the conversation moved beyond the numbers. She told him about Thomas. Not a great deal, not in the way of someone unburdening themselves, but in the way of someone who believes in honesty and who has had enough time with grief to speak about it without being consumed by it. Thomas Beckett had been a good man and a dedicated physician, and she had loved him, and when he had died of the disease he was trying to treat, she had been devastated in the way that is total and structural, the way a foundation gives out and everything above it shifts. "The San Antonio house was his," she said. "Every room of it had his shape in it. I could not stay." "So you came here," he said. "I came somewhere without a shape yet," she said. "Somewhere I could make my own shape." He was quiet for a moment. "That is a brave choice." "It is a necessary one," she said. "There is a difference." He looked at her. He said, "My father died when I was 14. I built this ranch largely because I needed something to prove. To him, I suppose, even after he was gone. The difference between brave and necessary is something I understand." It was more than he had said about himself to another person in a very long time. He was aware of that. He did not take it back. She looked at him with those steady gray eyes and said, "I think you are less frightening than your reputation suggests, Mr. Covington." "I am exactly as frightening as necessary," he said, and she laughed, really laughed for the first time in his presence. And it was the kind of laugh that was entirely herself, clear and unguarded and genuine, and he felt it in his chest like a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for years. He stayed for 2 hours. He did not mean to stay for 2 hours. He rode home in the deep evening light feeling like a man who has just discovered, midway through a journey he thought he knew well, that the terrain has been entirely different from his map. Rosa had supper on the table when he arrived. She looked at him for a moment and said nothing, which was itself a kind of statement. "She is not selling to Voss," he said. "Good," Rosa said. "She knows what he is now." "Good." He sat down. He picked up his fork. He said. She laughed. Rosa looked at him, a long, careful look. Then she sat down across from him and said very gently, "Marshall, when is the last time someone made you laugh?" He did not answer. But he thought about it. sitting there in his kitchen that he had built with his own hands, in the ranch that he had built with his own will, in the life that he had constructed very carefully around the things he could control, and he could not immediately identify the last time anyone had made him laugh, and that fact landed in him like a stone dropping into deep, still water. August moved into September, and the drought broke in the last week of the month with a spectacular 3-day rain that left the creek running high and the pastures green in a way that felt almost impossible after the long summer's gold. The rain was a relief to everyone in the county, and it brought a quality of lightness to the air that people who live close to the land understand intimately, the specific hope of a season turning. Marshall found reasons to be at the Beckett property 4 times in September. She found reasons to be at the Covington ranch 3 times. They stopped pretending these were purely practical visits sometime in the middle of the month, though neither of them said so directly. He brought her a rain gauge because he had an extra one, and she needed one, and that was simply logical. She brought him a loaf of bread and a jar of put-up preserves made from the small harvest her kitchen garden had yielded, and she sat on his porch and told him about the satisfaction she had felt in making them, and he listened with the full, undivided attention he gave to things that mattered. He asked her, on one of those September evenings, about her life before San Antonio. She had grown up in Missouri, she told him, in a family that valued education above most other things. Her father had been a schoolteacher. She had been for 3 years before her marriage a schoolteacher herself. She had loved it. She had loved the specific work of watching people understand things, the moment when comprehension arrived in someone's eyes. "You miss it," he said. "I do," she said. "There is no school in this county yet. I have looked." "There was one briefly in 1873, he said. "The schoolteacher left after 1 year. The county has not been able to attract another one since." She was very still for a moment. "Why not?" "Money," he said. "The county cannot pay what is considered competitive. And this is considered a hardship posting." She looked out across the evening pasture. "I wonder," she said, and then stopped. "What do you wonder?" "If the county might be persuaded to reconsider the terms," she said. "If someone were to supplement the salary from private sources, for instance." He looked at her. "That would require someone with enough standing in the county to make the argument effectively. Someone like the owner of the largest cattle operation in Haskell County, perhaps," she said, and her eyes were carefully neutral and absolutely knowing. He was quiet for a long moment. "You would want to teach again." "I would want to teach here," she said. "The children in this county deserve a school." He thought about it for exactly as long as he needed to think about it, which was not very long. He knew the county commissioner. He had, in fact, done the man a significant financial favor 3 years ago that had never been fully reciprocated. He knew the practical argument for a school in terms of attracting and retaining farming families, which meant tax base, which meant improved county services, which was the argument that would carry weight. "I will speak to Commissioner Aldrich," he said. She looked at him, and the expression on her face was not gratitude exactly, not the reflexive performed gratitude of someone who has learned to be grateful on demand. It was something more considered than that. It was recognition. "Thank you," she said, genuinely. "It is a practical matter for the county," he said, because he was still, in September of 1878, at least pretending that everything between them was practical. She smiled. It was a small smile, precise and warm, and it undid him completely. October came, and with it the fall roundup on the Covington ranch, which was the most demanding period of the working year and left Marshall exhausted in a way he welcomed, because exhaustion was clean and honest. He was in the saddle 16 hours some days. He had no time for visiting neighbors. He had no time for anything except cattle and fence, and the relentless logistics of moving 800 head to winter pasture in an organized and effective way. But he thought about her while he rode. He thought about her at odd moments throughout the days, and in the evenings when he was too tired to prevent his mind from going where it wanted to go. He thought about her gray eyes and the way she listened, and the laugh he had heard exactly twice, and wanted to hear again with an urgency that embarrassed him. He finally admitted to himself sometime in the second week of October, somewhere between checking the South herd count and arguing with his conscience, in the process of falling in love with Beatrice Beckett. This was an inconvenient discovery. He turned it over in his mind with the same methodical attention he gave to any complex problem, looking at it from multiple angles, examining the practical implications, cataloging the risks. She was a widow not yet 2 years past her husband's death. She had come here to build something of her own. She had said so explicitly. She was independent in a way that was not merely temperament but philosophy. He was not a simple man to love, and he knew that. He had been told it plainly by the only other woman who had tried. He could not see any clear path through these complications. He also could not make himself stop. He rode to the Beckett property on the last Sunday of October, after the roundup was finished and he had slept for 12 hours straight and eaten a real meal and felt, for the first time in 3 weeks, like a person rather than a working machine. She was in the yard when he arrived, putting down fresh straw in the chicken coop for the cold weather, and she looked up when she heard him, and the expression on her face when she saw him was the expression of someone who is glad to see a particular person and is not hiding it. "You survived the roundup," she said. "I always survive," he said, dismounting. "You look like you did it with very little sleep and a great deal of stubbornness," she said. "That is a fair description of my standard approach to most things," he said. She came out of the coop and latched it and looked at him with those eyes that never seemed to miss anything. "Come in," she said. "I made soup." He came in. She made him eat soup, which was very good, thick and vegetable-heavy from the last of her garden harvest. They sat at the kitchen table and ate and talked, and the light outside moved from afternoon to evening, and neither of them noticed immediately. He told her about the roundup. Not the operational details, but the feel of it, the specific satisfaction of that kind of exhausting physical work. The way the land looked from horseback in the early morning, with the mist still in the low places. The sound of 800 head of cattle moving at dawn. He told her things about this land and this life that he had never articulated to another person because there had never been another person who would understand them. She understood them. "Do you ever regret not going somewhere else?" she asked. "Somewhere less demanding?" He considered this seriously. "No," he said. "This land asked a great deal of me, but it gave a great deal too. That is the agreement I made with it." "That is exactly how I feel about being here," she said quietly. "Even though it is harder than I anticipated." "It gets easier," he said. "Not the work. The work stays hard, but you get stronger." She looked at him across the table. The lamp was lit between them, and the evening had come fully down outside, and they were alone in this kitchen she had made her own, and the distance between honesty and silence had become very small. "Marshall," she said. It was the first time she had used his name. Not Mr. Covington. His name. "Beatrice," he said, and it was the first time he had used hers, and the sound of it in his own voice surprised him with its rightness. "I want to tell you something," she said, "and I want you to hear it before you say anything in response." He nodded. "I came here to build a life," she said. "My own life, independent of anyone else's expectations or needs. I intended to be alone, not because I preferred loneliness, but because I preferred my own terms to anyone else's." "I understand that," he said. "I did not anticipate you," she said. "I want you to know that clearly. You are not something I was looking for or planning for, but here you are, and I am finding that the life I am building has a shape that I did not expect, and I am not certain what to do with that." He was very still. "I was not looking either," he said. "I am considerably worse at admitting it than you are." "You are not so bad at it," she said. "I am somewhat terrifying as a prospect," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not entirely joking. "You are challenging," she said carefully, "but I am not afraid of a challenge. I moved to a drought-ridden Texas ranch in a widow's dress with 2 trunks and a box of books. I have a certain tolerance for difficulty." He looked at her for a long moment. This woman who had arrived in his county without warning and had surveyed his property and corrected his boundary line, and refused to be intimidated by his gun or his reputation or his formidable silence, who had read the county records and spoken to the water level data, and learned to set willow stakes correctly on the first try, who had made him tell her things he had not said aloud in years, who had laughed in a way that went through him like light. "I would like to court you properly," he said, "if that is something you would permit." The word was old-fashioned. He knew it. He did not care. He meant it precisely. She looked at him across the lamplight. "Yes," she said, "that is something I would permit." What followed was the most careful and most deliberate courtship in the history of Haskell County, which was saying something because Haskell County had seen some very methodical people. They met twice a week through November, alternating between his property and hers. He brought her water level data, and she brought him her irrigation plans, and they talked about practical things and impractical things with equal seriousness. He attended church with her in November, which prompted every resident of Haskell County to pay extremely close attention. Marshall Covington attending church with the Beckett widow was the kind of social event that people would remember the precise date of. She met Rosa, who regarded her for a long moment and then said, "You are the first person who has ever made that man leave his ranch at a reasonable hour on a weekday." And Beatrice had said, "I will take that as a compliment." And Rosa had nodded and said, "It is." And they had understood each other completely after that. He met her difficulty in November, too, which was the thing he had not anticipated. Gerald Voss had not given up. He had come back to the Beckett property in late October with a new argument, which was that without a reliable water supply through the winter, the Beckett vegetable operation would fail. And if it failed, she would be in a financially untenable position by spring. He had cited a legal question about creek water rights that he claimed had been raised by a party he declined to name, and he had suggested, with the smooth concern of a man practiced in manufactured sympathy, that an early sale at a good price would protect her from a very difficult situation. Beatrice had not sold. She had also, in the 3 weeks between Voss's visit and the Sunday when she told Marshall about it, handled the creek water rights question herself, going to the county seat in person and speaking to the county clerk, and obtaining the relevant documentation that showed her water rights were fully secured under her property deed. She told Marshall all of this over coffee at his kitchen table, laying out the documents as she spoke, and he listened to the whole account before he said anything. He cited a party he declined to name, Marshall said. "Yes. Who do you think that party was?" "I have no idea," she said. "Perhaps no one. It may have been a fabrication. Or it may have been an actual party who had been persuaded or paid to raise a question they had no real grounds for," Marshall said. She looked at him. "You think someone put Voss up to it?" "I think Voss does not operate independently," Marshall said. "He is a front man for someone with more resources and less visible ambition. I have thought this since the first property I saw him acquire." "Who?" He was quiet for a moment. "There is a man named Elton Cairns who owns the Cairns Catlery south of town. He has been expanding his land holdings for 3 years. 2 of the 3 properties Voss has acquired in that time have subsequently been sold to Cairns at a substantial profit for Voss and a below-market price for the original owner. So Cairns wants the Harlow property," she said. "He wants the creek access," Marshall said. "The creek that runs through your property and mine is one of the most reliable water sources in the county. Control of both properties bordering it gives someone controlling interest in the most valuable water resource in this region. And you," she said slowly, "he would want your property too." "He has already made me an offer," Marshall said. 2 years ago, I declined it with considerable directness." "So he went around you," she said. "He waited for a more vulnerable point to appear." "Yes," Marshall said. She was quiet, looking at the documents on the table, and he watched her think through the implications with the systematic clarity he had come to recognize and deeply admire. "Then this is not just my problem," she said finally. "It is not just your problem," he agreed. "What do we do?" He had already been thinking about this for 3 weeks, since the moment Deke first mentioned Voss's appearances at her gate. He had made certain inquiries through channels he had built over 11 years of operating in this county. He knew things now that he had not known in October. "Commissioner Aldrich," he said, "is going to receive documentation this week of a complaint filed by Mrs. Beatrice Beckett and Mr. Marshall Covington jointly regarding the specific practices of Mr. Gerald Voss as they relate to the fraudulent creation of legal uncertainty for the purpose of inducing distressed property sales." She stared at him. "You have already prepared it." "I have prepared a draft," he said. "I wanted to speak to you before filing." "How long have you been working on this?" 3 weeks, he said. She looked at him for a long moment with an expression he could not immediately read, and then she said in a voice that was very quiet, "You have been protecting me without telling me." "I have been addressing a legal situation," he said. "Marshall, Beatrice." "You have been protecting me," she said again, and there was nothing accusatory in it, nothing diminishing. It was just a fact she was naming clearly and directly the way she named all facts. "Yes," he said. "I can protect myself," she said. "I know you can," he said. "You did. You went to the county seat and got the documentation yourself. You did not wait for me or anyone else." He paused. "I was not protecting you because I thought you were incapable. I was protecting you because the idea of Cairns and Voss forcing you off that land was not something I was willing to permit." The kitchen was very quiet. The November wind moved around the corners of the house. "That is a different thing," she said. "Yes," he said, "it is." She looked at the draft complaint for a moment. Then she looked at him. "Let us file it together," she said. They filed it together on the 23rd of November, in person at the county commissioner's office in Haskell. Marshall presented the document and the accompanying evidence, which was thorough and specific. Commissioner Aldrich, who owed Marshall a favor and knew it, received it with appropriate seriousness, and convened an inquiry within the week. The inquiry took 3 weeks and resulted in a formal censure of Gerald Voss and a recommendation for disbarment from property dealings in the county. It also produced enough indirect evidence of Elton Cairns's involvement to prompt a separate inquiry into his business practices that would occupy the county court for the next 6 months. Cairns was ultimately found to have engaged in fraudulent inducement in at least 2 of the 3 properties Voss had acquired on his behalf. He was required to pay restitution at market value to the families involved. His expansion ambitions were effectively ended. Voss left Haskell County in January. Nobody mourned his departure. The evening after the initial inquiry concluded, Marshall and Beatrice sat on her porch in the late November cold, wrapped in their coats, watching the stars come out over the Texas plains, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind, the kind that does not need to be filled. "It is over," she said. "The immediate threat is over," he said. "Cairns will continue to be a problem for some time, but not in this direction." "That is good enough for now," she said. They were quiet for a while. A coyote called somewhere to the north, and the night was very clear and very cold and very full of stars. "I would like to give you something," he said, which was not a sentence he had planned. It arrived in the way of things that come from somewhere deeper than planning. "What sort of something?" she asked. He reached into his coat pocket and brought out a small object, not a ring, nothing presumptuous, just a small piece of carved turquoise on a thin leather cord, the kind of thing a man buys at a trading post when he is thinking about someone and does not yet know what to do about it. "I bought this in September," he said. "I did not know why. I know now." She held it in her gloved hand and looked at it and then looked at him. "September," she said. "Yes. You were falling in love with me in September," she said. "I was stubbornly resisting falling in love with you in September," he said. "I did not succeed." She made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something softer, and he watched her face in the starlight and felt the particular terror and absolute rightness of a man who has finally arrived somewhere he did not know he was looking for. "Marshall," she said. "Yes. I believe I have been falling in love with you since you lowered your gun in the pasture and listened to a land survey argument," she said. which is perhaps the most unusual origin story for these feelings that I can imagine. It suits us, he said. It does, she agreed. He reached over and took her gloved hand in his and held it there in the November cold, and they sat like that for a long time, watching the stars, and the silence was perfect. He proposed to her on the 15th of December, 1878. He did it properly, which is to say deliberately and in person, and with full understanding that she was going to ask him questions, and that he had better have good answers. He came to the Beckett farmhouse on a Sunday morning with his good coat on and his hat in his hand, and a specific ring that had belonged to his mother, a simple gold band with a small diamond in a plain setting, which he had kept for 11 years in a box in his bedroom dresser because he had never before found the right person to give it to. She opened the door and looked at him and at the ring box in his hand and said nothing for a moment. "Come in," she said. He came in. They sat at the kitchen table, which was where they had all their most important conversations, and he put the ring box on the table between them. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want to do this properly, which means I want to say first that I know I am not simple, and I know this life is hard, and I know you came here to build something of your own, and I am not asking you to set any of that aside. I am asking you to build it with me. Your school, your land, your work, your terms. I am asking to be part of your life, not to replace it." She looked at the ring box and then at him. "You have been thinking about how to say this for a while," she said. "Since October," he said. "You were making land survey arguments in September and marriage proposals by October," she said, and the corner of her mouth moved. "I move quickly when I know what I want," he said. "Marshall Covington," she said, "you are the most stubborn, most exacting, most perplexing man I have ever met, and you have also been kinder to me than anyone has been since Thomas died, and I am deeply, thoroughly, wholly in love with you." "Is that a yes?" he asked. "It is profoundly a yes," she said. He put the ring on her finger, and then he stood up from the table, and she stood up from the table, and he kissed her for the first time, really kissed her, with the full force of everything that had been building since the afternoon in the pasture with the survey stake, and it was, in every possible way, exactly right. Rosa wept when she heard. She denied weeping. The evidence was conclusive. Deke Harmon shook Marshall's hand and said, "About time," which was the most words he had ever strung together on a personal subject. The county of Haskell received the news of the engagement with the collective satisfaction of a community that has watched two unusually difficult people find each other and feels, somehow, personally vindicated. They were married on the 12th of March, 1879, in the small church in Haskell, on a morning that came in clear and cold, and turned warm by noon the way Texas March days will do. The light coming through the church windows in long pale columns that fell across the wooden pews and the people in them, all of whom had come with genuine interest and something approaching joy. Beatrice wore a dress the color of cream, not white because this was a second marriage and she was a practical woman, but close to it, with a blue ribbon at the collar that she had chosen herself. And she carried a small bunch of the earliest spring wildflowers that Rosa had gathered that morning from the creek bank. She looked, Marshall thought, from his place at the front of the church as she walked toward him, like someone who had made a decision and had absolutely no doubts about it. He had no doubts either. He stood there in his good suit with his hat properly removed, and he watched Beatrice Beckett walk to him, and he felt, all the way down to the bedrock of himself, the particular certainty of a man who has finally gotten something exactly right. The minister read from the relevant scriptures. They made their vows. Marshall's voice was steady and direct, because that was the only way he knew how to say things. Beatrice's voice was clear and precise, because that was the only way she knew how to say things. And when it was done, he kissed her in front of the whole county, and she kissed him back with no self-consciousness whatsoever, and there was applause, genuine and warm. They celebrated at the ranch, because the ranch was where Marshall lived, and it was large enough to hold the people of the county who came, which was most of them. Rosa had cooked for 3 days. There was music, a fiddle player from town who knew enough songs to keep the dancing going until well past dark. Marshall did not dance, generally, as a policy and a conviction. Beatrice took his hand at the appropriate moment and looked at him, and he danced, to the considerable amazement of his foreman and everyone else present. "You told me you did not dance," she said, as they moved through the steps of a waltz that Marshall performed with unexpected competence. "I said I did not dance," he said. "I did not say I could not." "There is a difference," she said. "There is always a difference," he said, and she laughed, and he felt it, that laugh, the way he had felt it every time since the first, right in the center of his chest. She moved her belongings to the main house on the ranch the following week. Her books filled one entire wall of the sitting room, which Marshall had cleared for the purpose without being asked. She brought her practical things, her tools, her good iron pots, the rain gauge. She left some of the larger furniture at the farmhouse because the farmhouse was not going to sit empty. "What do you intend to do with it?" he asked. "I intend to live in this house with you," she said. "But the farmhouse and the land are mine. I am not selling them." "I would not have suggested it," he said. "Good," she said, and organized her books on the wall with the focused satisfaction of a woman putting things in their proper place. She opened the school in September of 1879 in the farmhouse, which turned out to be the ideal location, standing as it did in the center of a reasonable radius from the scattered farms and homesteads of the eastern county. Commissioner Aldrich had, after Marshall's sustained and persuasive argument, agreed to a county salary supplemented by a private contribution from the Covington ranch, which made the position viable. 12 children enrolled in the first week. By October, there were 18. Marshall rode over to check on her every day at noon because he was, as he had told her, a man who moved quickly when he knew what he wanted, and what he wanted was to see her at noon. He was not always subtle about this. She found it, rather than suffocating, deeply touching in the way of things that are done with genuine feeling and no pretense. She came home to the ranch each evening, and they ate dinner together, and they talked about their days, and the particular quiet of the ranch house that had been Marshall's private particular loneliness for 11 years became something entirely different. It became the comfortable quiet of two people who are enough for each other and who know it. He was still exacting, he was still demanding. He still had arguments with his foreman and strong opinions about property boundaries and the specific way harness leather should be mended. None of that changed. She had not expected it to change and did not want it to. What changed was the quality of the silence around all of that. There was someone in it now. Someone who understood him and was not diminished by him, and who, on the occasions when he was being unreasonable, told him so directly and without drama and was right. The first time she told him he was being unreasonable, he had gone quiet and stiff in the way of a man who is not accustomed to being challenged, and she had looked at him steadily and waited, and after a moment he had said, "You may be correct," which for Marshall Covington was the equivalent of a full and complete capitulation, and she had nodded and moved on, because she was not interested in his surrender, only in his honesty. He told her she was being stubborn on 3 separate occasions in the first year of marriage. She told him all 3 times that he was also being stubborn, and that they were therefore well matched. She was, on all 3 occasions, correct. In the spring of 1880, Beatrice told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen, in the morning, over coffee, with the directness she brought to everything important. He put down his coffee cup and looked at her for a long moment, and something happened to his face that she had only seen happen once or twice. In the moments when the armor he wore came down entirely and what was underneath was visible, which was a man of enormous feeling who had spent a great deal of his life pretending otherwise. He stood up from the table and came around to her and took both her hands and held them and said, "Are you well? How do you feel?" "I feel very well," she said. "A little queasy in the mornings, otherwise entirely fine." He looked at her hands in his, then at her face. "Beatrice." "Yes, I am," he said, and then stopped because the word for what he was not one he reached for easily. "Happy," she offered, That word is not large enough, he said. She squeezed his hands. I know, she said. I know exactly. He was extraordinarily careful with her for the remainder of the spring, which she found both touching and slightly exasperating. She told him she was not fragile and did not need escorting everywhere. He told her he was aware she was not fragile and that his attentiveness was purely selfish, because watching her was his favorite activity, and the pregnancy had simply given him additional material. She stared at him. He looked back at her with an expression of complete innocence. She laughed, and he looked satisfied in the way of a man who has learned that making her laugh is one of his primary skills and intends to continue deploying it. Rosa was triumphant in the quiet, dignified way of someone who has been right about something for a long time. The school continued through the spring, with Beatrice teaching until June, when she handed the session over to a capable older student who took the primary lessons through the remaining summer weeks under her supervision. She had by then made arrangements for a permanent second teacher, a young woman from Abilene who had come recommended and who arrived in August to take over the primary classroom. The child, a boy, arrived on the 14th of September, 1880, which was almost exactly 2 years to the day after Beatrice Beckett had first appeared at Marshall Covington's gate with a basket of bread and a land survey dispute. He came into the world in the main bedroom of the Covington ranch house, attended by the county doctor and Rosa, in the early hours of the morning after a labor that was long but without the most dangerous complications, and when he arrived, he was loud and certain of himself in a way that made the doctor smile. Marshall was in the room when his son was born. He had refused to leave. He held Beatrice's hand through the whole of it, which was not the custom, but Marshall's views on custom had always been that they applied to other people unless he found them personally compelling. When the doctor placed the baby in his arms, Marshall held him and looked at him with the same absolute, complete attention he brought to all things that mattered and said nothing for a long moment. "He has your eyes," Beatrice said from the bed, exhausted and luminous. "He has your expression," Marshall said, entirely unimpressed with what he has just encountered. She laughed, a tired, genuine laugh. "What shall we call him?" "Thomas," Marshall said and looked at her, and his voice on the name was careful and considered and full of everything it needed to be full of. She looked at him for a moment, this man who had lowered a gun and listened to a land survey argument and built her a school and loved her with a thoroughness that left no room for doubt. "Thomas Marshall Covington," she said. "Yes." Thomas Marshall Covington grew. He grew with the speed and certainty of things that belong somewhere, which he did, belonging entirely to the ranch and the land and the people who had made him a home before he arrived. He had his mother's gray eyes and his father's relentless attention to the world around him, and from a very early age he was interested in everything, which delighted Beatrice and kept Marshall in a state of permanent, engaged exasperation that was, in fact, the closest thing to joy he had ever felt. The school grew also. By 1881 there were 24 children enrolled, and the second teacher, Miss Clara Fenton, had settled in Haskell with apparent permanence. Beatrice returned to teach the upper students in the fall of 1881, when Thomas was a year old and Rosa had taken on his morning care with the unilateral decisiveness of a woman who has identified something she intends to do and will not be argued out of. The Covington Ranch operation expanded through 1880 and 1881, not explosively but sustainably, which was Marshall's preference. He brought in a small herd of Hereford cattle to improve his breeding stock, which was an experiment being tried on larger operations further east. He rebuilt the main barn with a design he and Beatrice had worked out together at the kitchen table over 3 evenings, because she had ideas about airflow and light access that turned out, when implemented, to be genuinely better than his original plan, which he acknowledged without any real difficulty, because he was a man who valued being correct over being seen to be correct. The legal proceedings regarding Elton Cairns concluded in the spring of 1881. Cairns was ordered to pay restitution and was effectively removed from the land speculation business in the region. The two families who had been induced into distressed sales recovered a portion of their losses, though not all of it, and both families remained in the county. Marshall made it known through the appropriate channels that the Covington ranch would not purchase any further land under such circumstances, which was its own kind of statement. The injustice of those earlier forced sales could not be fully undone, and Marshall and Beatrice both understood that, and they discussed it honestly. There were things the legal system could not restore, but the county was, on balance, a better and more honest place for the proceedings having happened. In the winter of 1882, they had another conversation at the kitchen table that began with practical planning and moved somewhere else, as their kitchen table conversations often did. "You have been thinking about something," she said, because she could always tell. "I have been thinking about the north pasture," he said. "The north pasture has enough grass for another 30 head, she said promptly, because she knew the ranch as well as he did by now, possibly better in some particulars. "It does," he said. "But I was not thinking about cattle." She looked at him over her coffee cup. "I was thinking about building something up there," he said. "A second house, a small one, with enough land for a working garden." She was very still for a moment. "Why?" "Because Rosa's sister is in San Antonio with 3 children and a husband who is not reliable," he said. "And Rosa has not said anything about it, but I believe she is worried. And because this ranch is large enough and well enough established that we could support another family on it without difficulty. And because it seems to me that we have more than we need and there are people who do not." She looked at him. She looked at him for a long, careful moment. "You have been thinking about this for how long?" she said. "Since October," he said. "It was January. Since October," she said, "and you said nothing." "I was working it out," he said. "I wanted to be certain before I raised it." She put down her coffee cup and reached across the table and took his hand, and he looked at their hands, hers and his, on the worn surface of the kitchen table, and she said, "Marshall Covington, you are not as frightening as your reputation suggests." "I told you that when we first sat on this porch," he said. "You disagreed then." "I said you were less frightening than your reputation suggested," she corrected. "I was right then, and I am more right now." He turned his hand over and held hers. "What do you think about the house?" "I think we should build it," she said. "I think we should invite Rosa's sister and her children to come. I think you should tell Rosa soon, because she has been worrying since August and she is too proud to say so." "September," he said. "She has been worrying since September. I noticed in October." She stared at him. "You noticed she was worrying in October, and you have been planning how to address it for 3 months without saying anything." "I wanted to be certain of the plan before I raised it," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said with immense fondness, "You are the most particular human being I have ever known." "Yes," he said. "You chose me anyway." "I chose you because of it," she said. "Or partly because of it." He squeezed her hand. "Rosa's sister is named Maria. The children are 7, 9, and 11. Have you already written to her?" "I have drafted a letter," he said. "I wanted to speak to you first." "Send the letter," she said. He sent the letter. Maria Delgado and her 3 children arrived in April of 1882, after a difficult few weeks of arrangement that involved Marshall quietly assisting with the extraction from a situation that was worse than Rosa had allowed herself to say. The second house was not yet built, so they stayed in the main house through the spring, which was crowded in the specific warm way of houses, full of children and cooking and noise. Marshall was surrounded by noise for the first time in his adult life. 6 children under 12, counting Thomas, Maria's 3, and 2 children from a neighboring family who arrived every day for Beatrice's informal schooling sessions for the younger ones. He sat in the middle of this chaos in the evenings, and had the expression of a man who had expected to find it intolerable, and was uncertain how to account for the fact that he did not. Beatrice watched him from across the room one evening as Thomas climbed onto his lap without invitation, and Marshall settled the boy there with the automatic ease of long habit and went back to reading his ledger with one arm around his son, and she felt something so complete and so warm that she had to look away for a moment, at the window, at the spring evening outside, and take a breath. He looked up and found her looking away and knew why. He said nothing. He looked back at his ledger. But his hand moved on Thomas's back, a small, certain gesture, and she saw it. The second house went up in the summer of 1882, built by Marshall and Deke, and 3 other hands over 6 weeks, with the same careful precision Marshall brought to all construction. Maria Delgado moved her family into it in August, and she proved to be like her sister, a woman of formidable practical competence who shortly had a garden going that rivaled Beatrice's and had begun teaching the county's youngest children in her kitchen 3 mornings a week, which folded naturally into the school program. Beatrice's school by this time had outgrown the farmhouse. In the fall of 1882 they held a county meeting, the first of several, about building a proper schoolhouse. Marshall presented the financial case with his usual precision and prosecuted it with his usual relentlessness, and the county voted in favor, and the schoolhouse went up in the spring of 1883, a simple, solid, well-made building on a piece of land that the county provided, and that Marshall had surveyed personally, with a corrected and fully documented baseline this time. At the dedication of the schoolhouse in April of 1883, Beatrice stood at the front of the new building and looked out at the families of Haskell County who had come, the ranchers and the farmers and their children, and she spoke about what education meant to her, about her father the schoolteacher, and about Thomas who had died working to heal people, and about what it meant to build something that would last. Marshall stood at the back of the gathering and listened, and he was very still, the way he was still when something mattered beyond his ability to manage it. She found him after when the crowd had dispersed and the children were running in the new yard and the parents were talking in groups, and she came and stood next to him and did not say anything immediately. "You are quiet," she said finally. "I am always quiet," he said. "Less so than you used to be," she said. He looked at the schoolhouse, at the children running, at the new-made thing standing in the afternoon light. "I was never quiet the right way," he said. "I was quiet the wrong way." She took his arm. "And now," he put his hand over hers. "Now," he said, "it is different." She leaned against him slightly, in the easy way of people who have been beside each other long enough that it is simply natural. "Thomas is going to be a terror when he starts here in the fall," she said. "He is going to be exceptional," Marshall said. "Exceptionally terrifying," she said. "He comes by it honestly," he said, and she laughed, and he looked at her, the way he had looked at her every day for 4 years and more, and felt exactly what he had always felt, which was the specific complete rightness of something that was always supposed to be true. In the summer of 1883, Beatrice told him she was expecting again. This time she told him in the evening on the porch, watching the sunset, and he received the news with the same quality of complete attention, except that this time there was no armor to come down, no practice containment to work through, because she had taken all of that apart over the course of 4 years and he had helped her do it because he wanted to. "Another boy," he said. "I have no way of knowing," she said. "I have a strong feeling," he said. "You have a preference, you mean," she said. "I have a daughter's name ready," he said. "I have had it ready for 2 years." She looked at him. "What is the name?" "Margaret," he said, "after my mother." She was quiet for a moment. "Margaret Covington," she said. "Margaret Beatrice Covington," he said. She looked at the sunset for a moment, then at him. "That is a very good name," she said. He was right. It was another boy. He arrived in February of 1884 in the same room his brother had arrived in, loud and purposeful and apparently convinced that he had important business to attend to. They named him William, for Beatrice's father, and he was from the beginning a fundamentally different creature from Thomas, where Thomas was careful and systematic and observant. William was immediate and energetic and absolutely certain of everything, which Deke said was exactly like his father, and which Marshall disputed with the slightly guilty expression of a man who knows the comparison is accurate. Thomas was 3 1/2 when William was born, and received his brother with a considered, serious expression that eventually resolved into acceptance. He regarded William as an interesting and somewhat unpredictable natural phenomenon that required observation and occasional management, which was, in miniature, precisely how Marshall regarded most of the world, and Beatrice watched this and found it so thoroughly charming that she could barely speak. The ranch had become, by 1884, something larger and more complex than Marshall had originally built. It was not just cattle now. The Covington property included the farmhouse and Beatrice's original kitchen garden, now expanded significantly and producing enough to supply not just the household, but a regular arrangement with the general store in town. It included the second house and Maria's family's growing contribution to the operation. It included, effectively, the school, which Marshall funded and Beatrice ran, and which was the center of educational life for the eastern part of the county. It was a community that had grown up around two people who had come at each other sideways, through a property dispute and a land survey and a basket of bread, and 4 years of stubborn, gradual, absolute love. In the fall of 1884, Marshall did something he had never done in 11 years of operating the ranch. He took 2 weeks away from it. He arranged things very carefully beforehand, as he arranged all things, ensuring that Deke and the senior hands could manage without him, that the operations were in good order, that nothing would be left to chance. He told Beatrice 3 weeks in advance that they were going to San Antonio, just the two of them, leaving Thomas and William with Rosa and Maria, and that she was not to argue about it. She argued about it briefly and then capitulated, because she wanted to go. They took the stage to Abilene and the train from there, which was still a novelty in 1884, this particular line having come through the previous year, and Beatrice sat beside him on the train and looked out the window at the moving land, and he watched her watching it with the particular pleasure of a man who has discovered that the best thing he can do with his time is pay attention to this specific person. San Antonio was everything it had been, and also everything she had left behind, and she moved through it with the particular freedom of someone who is returning somewhere they are no longer defined by, who can see it clearly because they are no longer living inside it. She showed him the house where she and Thomas had lived, which had new occupants now, and she showed him the hospitals and the streets and the places that had been her life for 9 years, and he walked beside her and listened. She showed him the churchyard where Thomas Beckett was buried, and they stood there for a while, and Marshall stood with his hat in his hands and was quiet and respectful and present, because that was what was called for and he knew it. "Thank you," she said when they were back on the street. "For what?" He asked. "For coming here," she said, "for understanding why I needed to." "He was part of who you are," Marshall said. "You do not need to partition your life to include me in it." She looked at him. "You are remarkable, do you know that?" "I have been told I am exacting and difficult," he said. "You are," she said. "You are also remarkable. Both things are true." He took her hand there on the street in San Antonio in public, which he did not generally do. She looked at their joined hands and then at him. "Marshall Covington is holding someone's hand on a public street," she said. "Marshall Covington's wife is standing on a public street," he said, "and he is inclined to be next to her." "That is entirely romantic," she said. "I am an entirely romantic man," he said, with a perfect expression. "I have simply always expressed it through fence lines and water-level data." She laughed, there on the street in San Antonio, with the city around them and the October sun warm on their faces, and he watched her laugh with the same feeling he had felt the first time, right in the center of his chest, which had not diminished in 4 years, and which he understood by now would not diminish, ever. They spent the 2 weeks in San Antonio properly. They attended the theater, which Beatrice loved and Marshall had never experienced, and he sat beside her in the dark of the theater house and watched the performance with the same focused attention. He brought to all things and afterward had specific observations about the staging and the text that she found both amusing and characteristic. They visited a bookshop where she spent an entire afternoon, and where he bought her 4 books and pretended he had not been planning to. They ate at good restaurants and walked along the river in the evenings and slept in a proper hotel with clean sheets, and it was simply the particular happiness of 2 people who like each other thoroughly and have found something to do with that feeling. On the last evening in San Antonio, sitting in the hotel dining room over coffee, Beatrice said, "I am ready to go home." "Tomorrow morning," he said. "I know," she said. "I wanted to say it. I am ready. This was good to do, and I am ready to go home." He looked at her. "Where is home?" he asked, not because he did not know but because he wanted to hear it. She looked at him steadily with those gray eyes that had looked at him directly since the first day she had stood in his north pasture with a rusted survey stake and refused to run. "Haskell County, Texas," she said. "The Covington ranch, the kitchen table, the porch in the evening, you." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "Yes," he said, "that is exactly right." They went home the next morning, on the train through Abilene and the stage from there, arriving at the ranch in the late afternoon to a household that had evidently been managing very well without them, and was also very glad to see them. Thomas fell upon his father with the contained but fierce affection of a 4-year-old who has missed someone, and is determined to be matter-of-fact about it. William was carried to his mother by Rosa with the cheerful equanimity of a baby who had been perfectly happy for 2 weeks and had no particular complaints, but was willing to acknowledge that she was familiar and welcome. Marshall stood in the yard of the ranch he had built and looked at his house and his land and his family in the autumn light, and he was, by any reasonable measure, a man who had not been quiet in 6 years and would not be quiet again. He had talked, through Beatrice's steadiness and warmth and direct gray eyes, more honestly than he had talked to anyone in his adult life. He had laughed. He had danced. He had held his sons and built a second house and funded a school and held his wife's hand on a public street in San Antonio and said things he had not known how to say before she taught him by example, that saying them was not weakness but its own kind of courage. He went to her that evening on the porch, after the boys were down and Rosa had retired, and the ranch was quiet in the way it was quiet now, which was full rather than empty, and he stood beside her and they looked out at the Texas stars together. "Did you ever think," she said, "that first day in the pasture that it would come to this?" "No," he said. "You had a rusted survey stake and I had a pistol and I thought you were a complication." "I was a complication," she said. "The best kind," he said. She leaned into him, her shoulder against his arm, and they stood in the quiet that was not quiet anymore, the quiet that was full of 2 boys sleeping and a house alive with people and a county that had a school now and neighbors who looked out for each other, and a creek that ran clear through land that was theirs and tended and loved. He put his arm around her. "Beatrice," he said. "Yes," she said. "I love you," he said. It came as easily as breathing now. It had taken practice. He had practiced every day. "I know," she said. "I love you too." The stars were brilliant overhead. The creek made its sound in the dark. The night was cool and wide, and full of the particular peace that comes to people who have worked for something and gotten it. Not the getting of luck, but the getting of effort and honesty, and the willingness to stand in a pasture with a survey stake and tell a difficult truth to a difficult man, and wait to see what he would do with it. What he had done with it was everything. Margaret arrived in the spring of 1886, and Marshall, who had been correct about the name for 2 years, held his daughter for the first time with an expression that Rosa said afterward she would never forget as long as she lived, which was the expression of a man thoroughly and helplessly and happily undone. Margaret Beatrice Covington was small and loud and certain of herself, in a way that suggested she had not missed any of the family tendency in that direction, and she looked at the world from the beginning with something very like her mother's gray eyes, and her father held her and looked at her and was not quiet at all, not in any way. He was never quiet again. He had not been truly, since the day a widow in a gray dress had stood in his north pasture with a rusted surveying stake and refused to run, and told him, in the most practical and revolutionary thing anyone had ever said to him, that his eastern fence line was 17 feet into the property she had purchased from the Harlow estate, and that she could prove it. She had proven more than that. She had proven that a life built carefully and alone could become something larger without losing its integrity, that love between two exacting and difficult and genuine people was not a compromise but an expansion, that the right person did not make you someone else but made you more fully yourself. Marshall Covington had built a ranch out of grief and will and relentless energy, and it was a good ranch, and he had been right to build it and right to be proud of it. But the life that grew around that ranch, the school and the children and the neighbors, and the conversations at the kitchen table that went from water-level data to the nature of courage, the evenings on the porch and the dance he had not intended to dance, and the ring that had waited 11 years in a dresser drawer, all of that had required something he could not have built alone. He understood that now. He thought about it sometimes, in the evenings on the porch with Beatrice beside him, Thomas reading in the corner with his father's focused intensity and William organizing something energetically in the yard, and Margaret asleep upstairs with her fists curled, and her dreams whatever babies dream. He was not a man given to excessive reflection. But he was a man who had learned late and thoroughly the specific gravity of gratitude, which is not soft but solid, not passive but active, the kind that shows up every day and does the work. He showed up every day. He did the work. And the quiet widow who had moved next door to the fiercest rancher in the county had made a home with him, and a school, and a family, and a life. And the fiercest rancher in the county had never once been quiet again. And he was, in every possible way that mattered, exactly where he was supposed to be.